My friends, thank you so much for gracing the American Enterprise Institute this morning, in person or virtually. We have the great good fortune, I should say, I'm Kori Schake. I have the pleasure of leading the Foreign and Defense Policy team here at AEI. And it is my pleasure this morning to invite you into a conversation led by Jamie Kirchick to celebrate the outstanding new book of AEI's own Dalibor Rohac. I'm just going to introduce Jamie, though, and let him take charge of this. He is an award-winning author of two excellent books. One, Secret City, The Hidden History of Gay Washington, and the second, The End of Europe, Dictators, Demagogues, and the Coming Dark Age. Jamie, over to you. Thank you for celebrating Dalibor's work this morning.
Thank you, Kori. Thank you all for coming. I'm very delighted to be here to talk about this fascinating new book by my friend Dalibor, Governing the EU in an Age of Division, which does something very unique, and then it actually has something interesting and new to say about Europe and European politics. And I say that with authority because I've written a book about similar subjects, and I can tell you that the literature is quite, let's just say, not the most exciting, and this is a real exception to that. And it's a slim volume, but it's well worth the read, and it has a lot of insights. So I'm just going to let Dalibor begin by asking him, what is this book about? If you could distill it maybe into 5 or 10 minutes, what are the most important points?
First of all, thank you, Jamie, for joining us, and thank you, Kori, for the kind introduction. I suppose there is a sort of highbrow and a lowbrow way of thinking about the argument of the book. The highbrow route is that there might be two basic metaphors for thinking about politics and political institutions. One is the metaphor of order existing in space, both literal and figurative space, and the other metaphor is one of direction or project oriented towards the future. And whereas the first metaphor concentrates our minds on structure and distance and how different sort of elements of that order work together or not, the second metaphor, orients us towards thinking in a very sort of teleological way about, the steps that are required to get us to our destination. And I think both metaphors are quite illuminating when it comes to the EU and understanding what the EU is about. And the basic argument of the book is that people's understanding, and by people I mean both politicians and academics and thinkers and pundits who've been writing about the EU, that their understanding of the EU has been for a long time heavily tilted in the latter direction, understanding the EU as a project that is moving towards what the original treaties called ever closer union or a new qualitatively different form of democratic politics functioning across national borders. And this is already reflected in the Jean Monnet method of pursuing integration in Europe, which is to start cooperation within small, relatively technocratic sort of areas where little resistance will be encountered, with the hope that that cooperation will sort of spill over into other areas or will become inevitable across a broader range of subjects. For some people, this is just seen as a part of this sort of broader, inexorable march of progress that President Obama would refer to when he talked about the arc of history evoking Martin Luther King. And my contention is that while this helps us understand what the EU is about to a certain extent, it also risks fostering what the Italian political scientist Gian Domenico Magione called a political culture of total optimism, where it's sort of simply assumed that cooperation in certain areas will sort of have positive spillover effects elsewhere, and that hasn't exactly worked. You've seen these sort of cycles of overreach and under-delivery. You've seen the creation of a single currency that has not been translated into sort of integration efforts that were successful, that would sort of make the currency union work well. the European Parliament was created with the ambition of fostering, real European sort of political debate, real European political parties. Well, it's not exactly what has materialized. And so my basic message of the book is that it's okay that these things haven't worked out, and maybe we should just sort of accept the underlying diversity of Europe, the unwieldy nature of the continent as a feature, not as a bug, not as something to be overcome, but something to be managed. And there's a long history of people talking about the diversity and sort of divided nature of Europe as something that is essentially desirable. From Gibbon, who talked about Europe's divisions being productive of the most beneficial consequences to the liberty of mankind, basically making the argument that it's much harder to oppress Europeans if you are a local fief or a local warlord or a local king, as opposed to the Roman Empire, where the sort of same top-down approach is applied to all. Obviously, Europe's diversity has not been managed well, and the sort of long history of conflict, culminating in the two world wars, is an example of that. But by and large, when you sort of look at the EU through this metric, it's been a stellar success. I mean, it's 70 years, yes, under US security umbrella, but having this platform of managing diversity and disagreement. I mean, by the sort of looking at it through those lenses, I mean, there's a lot to celebrate about the European project once you sort of adopt this sort of more modest perspective.
Thank you. Kathleen, what is your rejoinder or criticism or...
So yes, Dalibor asked me to attend, and that he explained that my role would be to sort of say everything that's wrong with the book, which I thought was a lovely sort of invitation. And I immediately said yes, of course, because there's nothing more fun, right, than arguing, discussing around these kinds of ideas. So I will say, first of all, and I think Jamie sort of hinted at this, this book is rich, it's provocative, it's expansive, it's very passionately argued, and therefore it makes for a really enjoyable read, right? In my response to it, I'm going to sort of take a big picture kind of meta response because, as an academic, that's what I do. I think there's a lot of things, hopefully we'll get to, and Jamie will point us towards, around particularly kind of questions of Central and Eastern Europe and what Dalibor puts in quotes, democratic backsliding, unquote. And I'd love to sort of get into that. But why don't we start with sort of, what I do disagree about. And what I do disagree about is, first of all, Dalibor's case that he makes for the severity and nature of the problem and sort of the diagnosis of what's wrong with the EU, and also the cure. What should the EU do about it? What would be the right answer? So first, on the severity and nature of the problem, I would say, his conceptualization of how people think about the EU as this sort of teleological project of inevitable progress and so on and so forth, as opposed to thinking about it as a political order with all its turbulence and problems and challenges. I think that's a very, very sort of old way of thinking about the EU that really has been sort of dead and gone for at least a decade, if not more. I go to Brussels, I study the EU, and I would say that people around the EU, except for maybe a few very old committed federalists or something, see it very much as a living, breathing, political contested thing. So I would sort of disagree with your initial framing of the book, which I don't think sort of makes the book uninteresting at all, but I would say that's a bit of a straw man that I think we don't need to use. More interesting is your sort of diagnosis of the severity and nature of the problem. Again, there I think the book might have befallen a little bit of sort of academic publication timing problems, because I assume you had to send this off, 9 months, a year ago before it went into print. There's a lot of things that Dalibor says in the book about sort of the EU struggling in the face of the pandemic, the EU not coming together after Russia invades Crimea, the EU sort of as this floundering thing that has no geopolitical voice, that has no real capacity in confronting the problems it faces. And when I think about the EU over the last 9 months, as somebody who's studied the EU for 30 years or something, I'm astonished, actually, at some of the leaps forward that they've taken, and things are happening that are really surprising to me, that do go against, to some degree, the sort of traditional ways we think about the EU. So, I won't sort of go into them, but, the book right now talks about sort of vaccine nationalism and the problems initially around the pandemic and responses. And what we saw actually was, the EU finally getting itself together, which was not inevitable at all, but did get itself together, did establish a way to come up with a European vaccine, did actually move healthcare, which was not something that was at the EU level, but now is being moved to the EU level. The Next Gen EU program, which was this huge financing of mutualized debt, which the EU had never done before, right, comes out of the pandemic with a huge amount of money and policymaking going towards critical areas like climate change, the Green New Deal, digital security, all this other stuff. The European Chips Act, right? Very interesting, sort of mirrors what we've done in the United States. The SURE program, which was around employment during the pandemic. Essentially, there's sort of all these instances where the EU did things that were surprising and odd in terms of the EU's capacity, as well as, I would argue, the way the EU has confronted Russia and actually found a way to have significant solidarity in the face of some really challenging questions around energy, around geopolitics, et cetera. And then finally, on the sort of empirics, Dalibor, you write about Brexit in a way that also surprised me because you, I think, downplayed the seriousness of the withdrawal from the EU in terms of its impact on the British economy. And again, 9 months ago, that might have been the case, but I think we see today the difficulties that the UK has had, on top of everything else, in extracting itself from the single market. So the cure that you propose, right? Because you set up the problem in that way. The cure is really what you call having a sort of platform rather than a kind of centralized, integrated European polity and governance system. And I think about it as essentially you're proposing that the EU go back to something that looks like an international organization. Intergovernmental, right? Something where there's not a lot of political authority situated in Brussels, that the nation states, the member states have a much greater latitude for independent action, and so on. And again, a very valid and very interesting sort of set of proposals. But I think that this would mean a dismantling of the thing that you actually see, I think, as so central to what makes the European project a good project, which is the single market, right? And far be it from me to lecture people at AEI about how markets work, but I will anyway, okay? So why does this matter? Markets 101, right? Markets require collective public governance, i.e. politics, right? It's not an accident that we see capitalism developing over time in an integrated, scaled-up way at the same time as we see the rise of the nation state, right? It took the nation state and all of its kind of coercive, legal, political, fiscal, symbolic sets of political authority, right, to actually create the platform that you speak of for markets to work, right? And I won't rehearse this. If you've read Douglas North or a million of other people, you know this. Property rights, who owns what, governance of competition, fair playing field, rules of exchange, anything beyond barter, right? You need a very complex set of enforceable rules, right, to make that work. And so what I fear is that the EU, in its current sort of, quite successful single market, right, which my colleagues Craig Parsons and Matthias Matisse have a nice piece in Foreign Affairs where they spell out how actually the European single market in many ways is much more integrated than the American single market, right? Why has that worked? It's been because of this collective political governance at the center. And, despite the champagne fairs and all sorts of other ideas about how private actors can just come together and kind of decide on these things and it's all going to work out fine, I really don't buy that, right? So I think that this idea of the EU moving towards something that looks more like an international organization would really require the dismantling of what makes the EU so interesting for us political scientists, in that this group of nation states have created this incredibly robust, incredibly integrated single market alongside this set of levers and instruments around political authority. and I'll stop. I have so many other things to say, but I'll stop with, I think one of the problems is that in your mind, you create this binary between the EU, either has to be this sort of nation state that looks exactly like what we think of as, nation states created in the late 19th century, or it has to be an international organization. But I think we have to use our imaginations. And again, as a scholar, that's why I still study the EU, because it's so weird. It's such a strange creature, right? It doesn't replicate the nation state, but it's far more than an international organization. It really, truly has political authority at the center in ways that we haven't seen in other types of political entities. And so I would prefer to imagine that we can think about the EU as something that might be innovative, a laboratory for governance in the 21st century, and to gear our proposals about what it needs much more around that. Thank you.
Are there one or two points you want to take up before
Sure.
I ask a question?
So I'm somewhat surprised that you sort of read the book as advocating for a sort of dismantling of much of the sort of existing sort of institutional structure of the EU, because I was trying to actually sort of advocate for the exact opposite, which was to accept what exists in terms of treaties and acquis communautaire as a given, and think about ways in which European countries can work together within the sort of framework of those institutional constraints. Because for far too long, I think there has been this sort of abstract debate about international federalism and what the EU should be doing, shouldn't be doing, and then every 15 years we get an attempt to revise the treaties that ends up producing a document that's ever more complex and sort of convoluted and more confusing to Europeans. So my ambition was to, in a way, reduce the stakes of those debates and to say, Europe, as you said, is complicated, unwieldy, one of a kind, sui generis, far more than just an international organization, less than a state. And so how do we navigate this environment going forward? And so my sort of humble proposal was to emphasize within the institutional constraints that we have intergovernmental cooperation as opposed to the community method, as opposed to the idea that whenever a problem arises or whenever a group of countries feel that something needs to be addressed, that we go and try to fix it at EU27, where in foreign policy that creates, and in other areas where there is unanimity, that creates obviously this problem that you have actors like Hungary and other potentially bad faith actors sort of acting as stumbling blocks towards an agreement, while smaller subgroups of countries could be making progress. And I was also hoping to sort of reduce the stakes of these debates by saying that it's like we already live in an EU in which not everybody does everything with all the other countries, and where you have non-members participating in various aspects of the integration project. And again, I would like to sort of say that it's okay. Obviously, it can't be, as you said, free for all. And to me, really, what is the sort of beating heart of the integration project are the four freedoms, and what we could sort of loosely call the single market, though it's a little bit more than just the single market. And there, the European institutions exist for a reason, and I'm not sort of saying that we should go back to an era in which there are no European institutions and where it's all just totally ad hoc sort of intergovernmental cooperation. Like, we have these frameworks. But at the same time, it also strikes me just on purely sort of empirical grounds that the big steps, and yes, next generation EU, I would sort of perhaps put it to the side, although it's still being heavily contested, and you have countries that are not getting the funding and they think they should be entitled to it, etc., etc. But the big sort of policy steps taken over the past decade, I think, have been primarily intergovernmental in the sense that the stability mechanism in the Eurozone was created as a sort of ad hoc treaty between member states. Defense cooperation is de facto sort of intergovernmental in its sort of operation. Different groups of countries working on different sort of projects of their mutual interest. And again, my sort of contention is that that it's it's okay, and we should not be sort of afraid of an Europe that's that would likely become even more sort of convoluted and unwieldy as a result of this a la carte form of integration or cooperation. So that's my sort of big picture observation, but I'm happy to sort of get into the...
Let's take up a few of these tests one by one. I mean, you mentioned Ukraine and how impressive you thought the reaction was of the EU. How much credit does the EU...
I said
surprising. Sure.
And actually, that's an interesting point, because I come at this not from a normative perspective, but as a positivist, right, as a scholar. And I think that's why these conversations are useful, and I'm really thrilled that you invited me, because you know my work and you knew what I would be interested in. And I think so I just placed that there as an important point.
Let's get into that. I mean, why were you surprised, I guess, or were you surprised? How much, because there's some who would say, myself for instance, that the so-called German Zeitenwende, this transformation supposedly in defense policy and energy policy, there was much hype about this in February and March in the early weeks of the war. Have the Germans really lived up to the promise? Similarly, I mean, I wouldn't have the numbers off the top of my head, but the percent of the ammunition and the weaponry that's being sent to Ukraine, vast. I mean, the U.S. contribution obviously vastly outnumbers the EU contribution to this. So maybe we can get into a little more. I mean, this is the biggest test of European security since the Cold War. How would you think the EU has responded? And what does it have to do with the arguments in your book?
I suppose it's fair to say that there has been a display of unity that has gone beyond the expectations of most reasonable observers. At the same time, I mean, you also can see the weak links in all of that. You have the Hungarian government campaigning very openly for rollback of sanctions, having domestic propaganda campaigns that they try to accuse Brussels of bankrupting the Hungarian economy. I mean, seeing the Brussels sanctions as they call them as the problem, not Russian aggression. So this is happening at the same time as we have this sort of supposedly unified front. But I think it's also fair to say that it's just the sort of perception of the threat posed by Russia has not been seen through the same set of lenses across the EU, and even way beyond just Hungarian particularities. And for the French, for the Germans, it just doesn't carry the same existential weight as it does for the Estonians and the Poles and.
Though interestingly, you mentioned in your book that something like 60% of Slovaks have a pro-Russian view. I found that surprising.
I mean, these sort of like geopolitical sensibilities in Central and Eastern Europe are extremely complicated. So on the one hand, you have the sort of traditionally hawkish countries like Poland and the Balts, but then you have countries that might even have a historic experience with Soviet/Russian oppression, yet they also harbor a dislike of the United States, of sort of Western liberal political order, and in Bulgaria and Slovakia and Hungary, I mean, these debates are just far more complex. But what I'm saying is that these serve in a way as sort of constraints on how unified the EU can be in the face of what strikes me as a pretty much an existential crisis, as a direct challenge to security order in Europe. And so if this is the sort of degree of sort of consensus and resolve we can get, well, I don't think it exactly bodes well for optimism when it comes to perhaps lesser crises or situations that will divide Europeans even more.
Yeah, so I mean, this is a great question, but I guess what I find more interesting in terms of these conversations is not to sort of, the EU, is it good and successful or is it bad and not successful, right? That, that's kind of crazy, right? Because again, the EU is, like the United States, a big kind of diverse, pluralistic, much, in fact, more complicated than the federal US system. And therefore, that sort of yardstick, or, I mean, I like the way you have a glass half full, half empty as one of your chapter titles, right? Because you can read it either way, right? So more interesting is to kind of think about these different crises and how the EU is responding in terms of the overall transformation of the EU, compare and contrast, right, with other political entities. That's also quite interesting. And so how do I think about the Ukraine crisis and how the EU has responded? I say it is surprising because the EU traditionally has actually sort of been very careful about stepping on member states' prerogatives and sovereignties around things like security, right, and other things as well. And so what I have seen that has surprised me over the last year is that there's more willingness for the EU to take a more aggressive posture in this kind of geopolitical stance, right? And that, as you say, Dalibor, it's exactly right. This is not a federal system. It's not a situation where the EU has an army, right? There is no one employed by the EU who can take a gun and make somebody do something, right? And so this is a very different entity. It needs to work and network into the member states. So there's a European Defense Fund, for example, that has recently begun, but it is completely networked into the member states. But again, how interesting, right, that it is this form of governance which involves centralization, but not employing that many people, right? The EU employs something along the lines of what Marseille employs, right, a small city, right? It uses regulatory powers, as you both know. And so what I've seen with Ukraine is a much more willingness to use words and to take actions which do take a more geopolitical stance, right? I wrote a piece in the Washington Post about Joseph Borrell's, talking about how the EU had been, too much Venus and they needed to be more Mars and more Hobbesian and less Kantian and all these buzzwords that international relations people think about, but was very, very surprising, right? And I know he's, maybe he was off his leash when he was doing all that. But to me, it's very, very surprising that the EU is moving away from what in my other work I've called its sort of banal authority, right? Where it's, again, it wants to not step on the member states' prerogatives and move forward in hand with people like Macron, right? The French president, who sees the EU as a place to do things like strategic autonomy, right? This new kind of buzzword for thinking about the EU in the world, right? To project French power through the EU. And so I agree with you about, the Germans, who knows what's exactly going to happen. But I think we've seen a bit of an interesting shift. I don't know how persistent it's going to be. I don't know how long lasting, but certainly something's changing in interesting ways.
Go ahead.
If I can just sort of step in for a moment. I think all those points are well taken. At the same time, like from where I sit, the EU's underlying diversity still remains, the sort of most important parameter of the whole construction. So there's this debate about strategic autonomy that's been going on, and one of the drivers is obviously the experience of the Trump presidency, the fear that maybe we shouldn't rely too much on the United States. At the same time, if you sort of insert this current war into the picture, if you insert Germany's and France's complacency over the years with regard to Russia, and if you President Chancellor Scholz went to Prague earlier this fall, and he told the Czechs that it's time to get rid of the principle of unanimity and have a sort of treaty change. To me that remains a distinctly unappealing proposition in the Central and Eastern European context, where you have these countries like Poland, like Estonia, that have been ringing the alarm bells over Russia for years, and now they're being told by these sort of older brothers to the West that let's pull forces together and let's create a situation in which you might be outvoted at every turn. If we see anything, and actually a group of AI scholars and our trustees, including Cory, we went to Poland not so long ago. If you see anything in Poland, that is a really cross-partisan consensus that the United States remains a vital part of Poland's security. So again, like that, many sort of useful things that the EU can sort of do and serve as a platform for doing. But again, this sort of like teleological sort of sense that we should be moving some, towards a sort of tighter and tighter forms of integration, and that those would be sort of unequivocally a good thing. Like that doesn't strike me as convincing. And I know that that's not what you're arguing for, but I think that sort of view of Europe is still more prevalent, at least among the commentariat than in the Brussels bubble than
Yes, I was going to ask you. I
want
believe
to
there was a chapter heading, I'm looking for it somewhere, after illusions. And isn't strategic autonomy really just a sort of romantic illusion? Or is there actually a practical chance of this happening?
Well,
practical purpose to it?
It's a buzzword that means different things to different people. If it means Europeans doing more on defense and cooperating whenever necessary. Right now, there is, for example, a proposal from the Commission, not sure whether it's been completed, which would provide an incentive for European countries to do the munitions procurement jointly, which, I mean, this strikes me as a good idea in the context of the fact that everybody is running out of ammunition because of help to aid to Ukraine. So, there are these things that the EU can do, but the sort of idea that within our lifetime, we'll see an EU that has actual sort of hard power and sort of assets at its disposal and acts on the world stage the same way, the United States or China or sort of other sort of global powers do. That strikes me as rather fanciful.
Well, in strategic autonomy, again, it's something in process, and we'll see. I don't think it's just a romantic notion, although I kind of like that phraseology. Why don't I think that? I think because, in my conversations with folks in the Brussels bubble, there very much is this sense that it would be unwise to count on the United States to trust the U.S., is the word that they use, in the way that they did for decades and decades and decades.
Can I ask a question? Are these Western Europeans or Eastern Central Europeans?
People in the European Commission, in the cabinet, who are made up of people from East and West, right? By law, it has to be that way, right? And so I think this is very much across the board. And again, as an international relations scholar, that makes sense, right? When the geopolitical landscape shifts, which it has, right? Then, and we haven't talked at all about China, right? That's the other player that the EU is very concerned about, right? And all of this intersects on, for me, the strategic autonomy story is much more interesting on the kind of geo-economic side in terms of what the EU is actually doing in a practical sense. And the EU is breaking things on a practical sense in a very interesting way. The EU is moving forward with something called European industrial policy, which is, again, quite surprising to me. The EU is built on the idea of a single market, on competition, on not playing favorites, on not choosing sectors to succeed, on dismantling barriers to trade, on providing a completely fair playing field, on not allowing mergers or collaborations across firms. And what they've done is actually develop a list of strategic sectors, just the strategic autonomy part, right? Chips, batteries, raw materials, active pharmaceutical ingredients, all the stuff which matters for supply chain resilience and matters as well for environmental sustainability and climate change, right? So they prioritize these areas. And this is sort of going down through all the different arenas that the EU is involved in. The single market, its trade and investment screening activities, its digital activities, its competition law and the way they prosecute sort of who's allowed to come together, right? There's this huge battery platform project which is bringing together people like Solvay in Belgium, this firm, with 19 other collaborators across the EU, and they're being allowed to do that. In the past, they wouldn't have been allowed to, right? There would have been lawsuits. Margareta Vestager, I don't know if I pronounced her name right, it's a big question mark, like Cutter, who knows how to say that, right? Now is allowing for all of these different things, which in some worlds could be seen as a perfect example of what my colleague Abe Newman and Henry Farrell have talked about as weaponized interdependence, right? Using global markets to enhance your own autonomy, but also to kind of produce the outcomes that you want to see in the world. And this is new stuff, and this is really, really interesting. And so to me, it's not just a romantic idea. It's actually trickling through, maybe not as much on the military side, which Corey could probably talk about, but I really see interesting changes, and we'll see how sustainable and how long it lasts, but the rhetoric and the policies are changing.
Let's talk about China. There's a story in the Wall Street Journal today that surprised me. It said that U.S. trade with Europe, the volume of trade with Europe, has now surpassed that with China for the first time in over a decade. German imports to the United States in particular have been up 50%. I'm just curious, is this just a consequence of the pandemic and the continued lockdown policies of the Chinese, or perhaps are we seeing the Europeans maybe waking up perhaps to the consequences of dealing with an authoritarian China? Are they going to be maybe backing away somewhat from the sort of closeness that they've been pursuing over the past 15, 20 years?
Well, it's a complicated question because I mean all of these things that you sort of alluded to are at play. On the one hand, there is a conscious policy, as I understand it, in China to decouple in some ways from the Western world and to make sure that the Chinese are not dependent on U.S., European, other technologies, firms, industries, and there has been in Brussels in particular a sort of awakening to the challenge that the Chinese regime poses. Economically speaking, there are now I think 16 different instruments that the EU has sort of introduced to deal with Chinese sort of commercial practices. It's a very ad hoc, and what I suppose maybe that would be a sort of point of contention between two of us. It feels somewhat untethered from the actual sort of national debates that exist with regard to China across Europe. So we've seen in Washington, we've obviously taken notice of the Lithuanian government, for example, being very vocal about the Chinese threat. To my surprise, that view is not shared among the sort of traditional sort of hawkish Eastern European countries. In Poland, in spite of its strong commitment to the transatlantic relationship, is also trying to develop a fairly sort of deep economic relationship with China. Isn't sort of jumping to thoroughly sort of hawkish positions. So I think there are many who are hedging their bets. I mean, it's very I don't know how to read the German case with Chancellor going to Beijing, holding a meeting, then leaving within 12 hours. At the same time, hearing from voices within the SPD that there has to be a sort of rethinking of Germany's relationship with China. I mean, it's a debate that's sort of ongoing and alive, much like the debate here, but it's far more complex in the sense that it's also 27 different debates.
Yeah, it's sort of a perfect storm, right? It's sort of what we would call overdetermined. It's hard to sort of figure out what is pushing. I'll have to take a look at that article. I think zero COVID on the Chinese part, I think the uncoupling really matters a lot. But I do also think, part of it is the Europeans waking up. I think as you, Jamie, sort of said, waking up to sort of think through the ways in which these economic relationships parallel political relationships and what's going to actually, produce better outcomes for both of those things in the long run. So there definitely is a shift happening.
We're now well into Brexit. Brexit's happened. What do you think the consequences have been so far in terms of the thesis of your book? Because I know there was a lot of catastrophism when Brexit passed, in which I participated somewhat. There was a lot of doomsday talk, a lot of attempts to stop it from happening. It led to the collapse of several it ended several prime ministerial careers. Where do things stand now?
Well, that's a good question. Again, like sort of untangling these complexities is not terribly easy. I don't believe that Brexit solved any of the grievances that British voters had with the EU or with their domestic political elites. I think like in 2016 today, the major hurdles to British economic performance are domestic, have never had anything to do with Brussels or the EU. In terms of, I mean, it clearly had an impact on trade, although sort of isolating that effect from the effects of the pandemic and other disruptions is hard. I mean, it is also hard to tell how much of this recent financial turmoil would have occurred, even if the UK decided to stay in the EU and pursue a sort of similar set of domestic policies. I mean, I do hope that on both sides there is an understanding that with the UK outside of the EU, there is still a strong case for the two parties to work closely together on matters of mutual interest. I was heartened to see former Prime Minister Liz Truss go to Prague for the European Political Community Summit to sign up for a relationship with PESCO. I mean, from where my sort of Central Eastern European friends sit, the UK is absolutely essential and has played an important role in Ukraine. So finding sort of constructive ways forward is good. At the same time, I mean, there are these sort of sores that are not going away because, I mean, just Brexit sort of, opened the question of the Irish border without providing a response, and there are real trade-offs involved in, retaking control while also, having a sort of open border regime in Northern Ireland, and we haven't seen a sort of convincing sort of answer to that. So I mean, it's likely to remain a sort of sore, difficult point going forward.
Yes, I think Boris Johnson might be able to be prime minister again in Ukraine. If you ran in Ukraine, you would have a good chance. Do you?
Just really briefly, I mean, I think, so Brexit to me kind of proves the point, circling back to Dalibor when you're saying, I don't want to lose the single market, and, that is crucial. And I'm trying to emphasize that the single market only works because of the acquis, which is the body of laws, which importantly are enforced by the Court of Justice of the European Union, which is the EU Supreme Court, right? It has supremacy over national law, right? So it's not like an international organization where the national laws are robust and there's no international, supranational set of laws, right? And so once you have that, you move into a situation which does open up the possibility of having this deeply integrated, scaled-up market, right? But also opens up, by definition, a whole host of questions, right? And talking about the European industrial policy is a perfect example of that. That markets are inherently dynamic, politics are inherently dynamic, and therefore you do need to have a politicized EU, which I actually think you and I agree on that, in the sense that in the book, Dalibor talks about the problems of this sort of technocracy and this sort of idealism of a sort of the EU should be a nation state and all this kind of stuff. And again, what I've seen, and I'm curious of what you would say about this, that the EU is becoming much more expressly and explicitly political, and I think that's a good thing. Technocracy can solve a lot of problems, but it's not sustainable in the long run, right? And so starting with, some people would argue Barroso, the European Commission president, moving on to Juncker, who talked about explicitly we need a political EU, something that's able to kind of, go through the pull and haul in politics and decide on the interests and values that a community shares, right? Rather than just having the rule makers and the technocrats decide on it. And now with Ursula von der Leyen, she's talked about a geopolitical EU. So I actually think there's a trajectory which is pushing in that direction that I think is healthy. I don't think it's easy, right? I mean, the EU is not a sort of democracy in the sense that it has sort of electoral representation and everything that we have in the United States. But I'm not afraid of the EU's diversity. Look at the United States, look at the kind of, culture wars we have in the United States. Look at the differences of lived experience depending on where you live in the United States and how that creates incredible political siloing and cleavages. I think it's a fascinating experiment, but I sort of see more hope for the EU going forward and continuing to try to resolve these problems rather than a scaled back EU.
So we're now at the point where we take questions from our audience, both in person and virtual. So if you are watching, there is a way to answer questions, and they will be transmitted to me here. so please do so.
Very
And
fancy.
Corey, you get the privilege to ask the first question.
So every time I hear the phrase European strategic autonomy, I feel like Prometheus watching his vultures drop in because we have been debating this since 1990, and I think in no area of public policy have European EU leaders promised more and delivered less to greater delegitimizing of their authority. This notion that they're going to agree on whose ammunition factories they are going to prejudice over everybody else's is a perfect illustration of the problem, because unless the answer is everybody's, you are going to have to say all of us are going to rely on French munitions, or all of us are going to rely on German munitions. And European governments and the EU have been unwilling to make those kinds of decisions that are simple, cost-effective for now, 33 years? So I'm deeply skeptical that PESCO or anything else actually represents a step forward for any deeper defense cooperation. Which brings me to my question. I'd love to know from all of the panelists whether you think the EU would have done more or less for Ukraine if the US hadn't, if the Biden administration hadn't admirably weighed in early and got NATO governments organized to do something. That is, people who advocate less American involvement in Europe say if we step back, Europeans will step forward. And I'd be interested, now that we have a very important security crisis in Europe, whether that has proven true.
Please.
Well, we obviously don't know the counterfactual, but my intuition is very clear about there being less action on the European side without U.S. leadership. I mean, these sort of vacuums that get created in a sort of leaderless world are not filled by leadership stemming from nowhere, but by sort of stasis and complacency and bad actors sort of moving things in a less constructive direction. So I think the sort of role that the U.S. has been playing in all this has been absolutely indispensable, notwithstanding Chancellor Scholz and Zeitenwende speech and all the rest of it. But also your initial point, I think, is well taken, because it sort of reminds me of this sort of early observation that Kate made with regard to the European industrial policy. I mean, it was one thing when you had national champions and industrial policy existing within European countries before 1980s and before the single market asserted itself. It's quite different enterprise. I mean, now it sort of exists in the abstract, but like once it starts creating real winners and losers across Europe, and once we sort of, and I'm very skeptical about how sort of industrial policies tend to operate in the real world. You could very easily imagine a backlash.
Why am I not surprised by that?
You can very easily imagine a backlash against a policy that sort of protects national champions in the old member states and legacy companies in France and Germany at the expense of others. So I think the sort of jury is very much still out on how sustainable this is in a setting that's not the nation state. I mean, you eventually end up running into a sort of version of the Roderick's trilemma in a way, where you sort of create sort of nation state-like policies in a context that's not a nation state. And there'll be people who won't like that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and I'm doing a research project on it, and it's very much driven by that point. It's how do you have a national industrial policy at the European level? Because it requires making really hard, explicit, visible political choices, which the EU has not done, right? They had the four freedoms. They, liberalized everything, and so it's a very different ballgame. So on verra, right? We'll see. But I'm sure you're right on strategic autonomy on the defense side. But I think I'm right on strategic autonomy on the political economy side. I think something really interesting and different is happening around carving out and using markets and structuring markets for political purposes. Huge fights about it, so open strategic autonomy as a way to kind of bring in, yes, we still like free trade, we're still gonna have free trade, but we care about China, we care about other parts of the world, we're gonna structure our market relations with them through that lens, and that's different. Ukraine, so I have a paper with Dan Kellerman that was published this year, where we basically talk about this idea in political science, war made the state and the state made war, right? War historically has been incredibly important to the centralization of political authority throughout time and place, right? And the EU, of course, has been this voluntaristic, peaceful project that hasn't engaged in direct war fighting, right? And we argue in this piece, and it kind of annoyed some of our European friends, that that's partly the explanation for this uneven development, and here you and I agree, right? That the EU has developed in sort of very uneven ways. It has a single currency, but not fiscal capacity. Why, we argue, maybe, history suggests, because they haven't had to have these things. They haven't had to fight a war. And so Ukraine is a very interesting test case, right? But it's not a perfect test case, because guess what? They haven't been invaded by the Russians, right? It's on the border. So it's not quite the existential threat that we see historically occurring when we see the centralization of capacity, right? So again, we'll see, but I think it's a fascinating question, and clearly the American security umbrella throughout the entire post-war era and NATO have taken, have done this heavy lift that has basically allowed the Europeans to move forward as this Pacific economic, political actor and not have the defense side. But we'll see where we go.
Thank you. Yes.
Good afternoon, thank you. I'm wondering if the panelists could comment on the potential impact of the current energy crisis on EU unity, which it's my understanding that it could last as a serious issue for the better part of this decade. I'm especially concerned because I feel like the energy crisis is inherently like a zero-sum nature that kind of encourages competition. We've seen a lot of outcry from Germany's announcement of the $200 billion euro internal aid package. France announced that they would not allow a pipeline connecting Spain, Germany going through their territory. So do you think that this poses a real threat to EU unity, or is it already well equipped for this?
You have a whole chapter on energy, so I'll let Dalibor say it. I guess I would say very briefly, everything that you've outlined is absolutely true. I think it's a very dynamic situation. I think it is playing out in ways that are, again, somewhat surprising from the past. The best case scenario is it moves forward the alternative, wind, solar, everything else. And a lot of people in Brussels are putting big bets on getting that all up to speed, and it fits into the entire Green Deal, European Green Deal program. But he's the expert. So.
Well, that's far too kind. So I agree that there is a sort of zero-sum aspect to some of the response, necessarily, given the circumstances. We just have less supply, and then you have countries sort of fighting over that sort of lesser supply. So the German subsidy is one example. There's also a great degree of disagreement among European countries on what should be the path forward, including in Eastern Europe, where I think it's fair to say that in places like the Czech Republic or Poland, some might be looking at the climate goals as a kind of luxury and something we can't really afford in Eastern Europe, which I'm not saying that's the sort of right way of thinking through this, but I think it sort of adds to the ambiguity around the EU's climate agenda, and it took a very long time for to get these countries on board and to sign up for the climate agenda, and it came at the price ultimately of categorizing nuclear energy as one of those sort of green or renewable options, so to speak. My wish, and this is nothing more than a wish, is for the EU and European institutions to play a role in sort of moving away from the zero-sum debate towards, what would you call a energy abundance agenda. So, thinking through policies that can bring about a sort of sustained increase in the supply of energy in Europe. And to me, the single market in energy and the third energy package adopted at the end of the previous decade have played an indispensable role in allowing for that. Like, you wouldn't have the interconnections that now exist between European countries. You would have already, even with all the Russian supply, the Russians would have been in a much better position to sort of coerce European countries through discriminatory contracts and so on and so forth than you had. So I mean, there is a role for European institutions to play. My hope is simply to focus on those constructive bits rather than trying to replicate zero-sum policies that exist at the national level, at the supranational one.
Hi. So my question is kind of in response to Professor McNamara's point about how war is this kind of foundational thing that most nation states have had to go through and cause their development, but the EU hasn't had that. But this question is for both Dalibor and Professor McNamara. I'm wondering, is there any, crisis or turning point short of war that could cause the EU to develop kind of more uniformly along the lines of a national state development? Or are we really just short of war in truly unproven territory where they will continue this kind of plodding, uneven development?
I think we'll just be in the half-pregnant thing for a good while. So I think about the EU, it's half-pregnant. And this is a really important debate in the kind of European politics literature. And people have come after us about this article, arguing there are these other crises, climate change, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a little symposium in something called Journal of European Public Policy around our piece where people make those arguments. But I would say my hunch is it's war or nothing.
Yeah, I think half pregnant is part of sort of nature of the European continent since the fall of the Roman Empire. It's not a coincidence that you have these sort of convoluted quasi-federal structures and leagues of city-states, and they come and go. And I think the EU is in a way part of that broad continuum. And again, that's okay.
It's an extremely long gestation period. I think we have time for one more question, which if there isn't one here, I'll go to the... I'm sorry. Yes, go ahead, please.
Thank you all for being here today. Professor McNamara, you mentioned the possibility of the European Union becoming more culturally integrated, like deciding on what are the common shared values of this community. And I'm wondering, to what extent do you believe that that is feasible, given that we see these different societies that seem to have, in some cases, polar opposite cultural values?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking. And in fact, it was something I didn't get to talk about. Dalibor, at one point in the book, talks about how nation states, successful political unions in the past, unlike the EU, had a robust sense of shared political identity prior to their founding. And I would say, no, they didn't. I would say, actually, if you look back at history, it's astonishing to me how we take for granted these common political identities. But the nation state is always and everywhere something that's constructed by motivated, savvy political actors, right, who want to create a common frame around a group of people in order to consolidate their power, right? So you see this again and again. I think you do cite Imagined Communities and Ernst Gelliner's work as well. One of my favorite books of all time is called Peasants into Frenchmen by Eugene Weber, who's a political scientist from Berkeley, or a historian from Berkeley. So we think of France as this, very early, centralized, unified nation state, right? And it turns out, no, it wasn't. It was really only, at the beginning of the 20th century that everyone in France started to think of themselves as French, started to speak the same standardized French language, started to share the same sort of cultural rituals around being French. And he details again and again the kind of really strong, often coercive things that the central political authorities had to do in order to create that outcome. I don't think we're there. I think the 21st century is different, right, than the 19th century. I don't think history replays itself. What I think is interesting, though, is the notion of creating a common European identity that's common but not as a single identity, right? And Dalibor, in the book, you really, I'm somebody who focuses much more on the Western Europe side. You really highlight beautifully, I think, the ways in which these are very contested values and interests. But I would say, the history tells us that, in fact, motivated political actors can accomplish a lot, but I think it's still an open question.
So I think it's a very sort of deep question of how much.
It's a terrible last question.
So political identity is endogenous to institutions and vice versa. To what extent it sort of precedes foundings of, say, the United States in late 18th century, or to what extent it's a consequence. But it strikes me that in the European context, we very often see political actors going about it the wrong way, so to speak. That there isn't an opportunity that is missed by European parliamentarians to put their foot in their mouth when it comes to even questions of democratic backsliding and rule of law in Central and Eastern Europe, which get conflated with pan-European, sometimes sort of even US-centric culture wars over gender, gay rights, immigration, and so on and so forth. And very often you have these sort of interventions that happen in a very sort of unconstructive, very often just purely symbolic, but highly unconstructive ways, providing fuel for the least responsible sort of elements of those national conversations in places like Hungary, Poland, and elsewhere. So it's not. I don't really see a sort of very clear path towards having a sort of intelligent pan-European conversation about what constitutes sort of European political identity.
Well, thank you very much.
On that cheerful note.
This is the book. They're available here, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Congrats.